Well, hello everyone. My name is Alan Drew. I'm the Climate Witness Project's East Coast Regional Coordinator. For those who don't know, the Climate Witness Project, or CWP, is a Christian climate advocacy organization that's dually overseen by the Christian Reformed Church in North America and World Renew, which is a faith-based humanitarian organization. Just a little bit of background on me. I have an undergrad in biology, so I love science. I grew up loving science, living systems in particular, ended up majoring in college. I have a Master of Divinity from Westminster Seminary in Glenside. I'm an ordained pastor in the Christian Reformed Church, North America. I spent 10 years pastoring a church plant, church startup in Mount Airy, which is in Northwest Philadelphia. So I have pastoral ministry experience. Actually did a few years of youth ministry before that. My home church is Spirit and Truth Fellowship. It's a Christian Reformed church in the Hunting Park neighborhood of North Philadelphia. There's their link for the web. And here are a few other links. There's the website for the Climate Witness Project. And here is another organization I'm involved in called the Hunting Park Community Solar Initiative. We do a bunch of different stuff. I'm not going to get into it in this particular talk, but there is the website where you can learn a little bit more about what we're up to there. So when you think of the climate crisis, what do you think of? Do you think of slashed and burned rainforests? Do you think of animals dying from drought? Do you think of polar bears with no ice, swimming and starving? These are some of the images that often come to mind as we're talking about climate crisis or climate change or things like that, and they're horrible. These images should break our hearts. Why? Well, they should break our hearts because anything that's living and that's beautiful, when we see it destroyed, that should impact us. We should be impacted by seeing beautiful living things be destroyed and die. But if for Christians, followers of Jesus, we have some other very clear reasons to be concerned about this. And let's just start off by looking at Genesis 1 to 2. So Genesis 1 to 2, first two chapters of the Bible, is the creation story. And in these two chapters, what do we learn about God's orientation towards the earth? Well, we learn that he loves all of it, loves it. If you go to Genesis 1 to 2, that whole creation story, it just, you get this repeated refrain again and again and again of God saying, it's good, it's good, it's good, it's good, it's very good as God creates things. So creation that the sense that we get in Genesis 1 to 2 is that creation is precious to God. In fact, it's so precious to him that he chooses this very specific creation of his, puts it in the world to tend it, to care for it. And that particular unique creation that has this special role is us, human beings. So what is the job that God has given us as human beings? Well, Genesis 2:15 says, "The Lord God took the man and put him in the garden to work it and take care of it." Now, that's an English translation of the original Hebrew, and I want to look at two of the words that we have, particularly the verbs work it and take care of it. So the first one that we translate work it here is the verb avad, and that actually has more of a service connotation. It really means to serve. It's the same word that's used in Joshua 24:15, where Joshua says, "As for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. We will avad the Lord." Right, so that's the first verb we get. And the second one, to take care of it, is the Hebrew word shamar. And that actually means more to watch over, to kind of carefully watch over. You can see that in Psalm 121, where you have this long litany of God talking about how he's watching over Israel, watching over Israel. So the same verb that's used over and over again in Psalm 121 to describe God watching over Israel is the one that people are given in Genesis 2:15 for how they are to relate to creation, to serve it, to watch over it. And so God has called us from the very beginning to care for creation and to protect it, to serve it, to watch over it. Right, but what about Genesis 1:28? This is a verse that gets used for a number of things. So here it is, Genesis 1:28. Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground. Now, like I said, Christians have used this verse as a justification for exploiting creation, of turning all this living system into just a collection of natural resources that exist for us. But does ruling over mean that God has given us the right to do whatever we want with creation? That's the core question. Well, there are all sorts of different kinds of rulers. Here's one. This is a ruler. And this ruler is a horrible ruler. He's destroying people's lives. But the fact that he's a ruler isn't the problem. It's the kind of ruler that he is. So in the same way, we are given this amazing role of stewardship, this special role from God to rule over creation. What kinds of rulers are we meant to be? How does God want us to rule over creation? Well, we get a sense of this as we look at Genesis 1:27. Here it is. So God made mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Image of God. So how are we to rule? Well, we're called to rule over creation as God's image, which really means as an expression of God's heart for creation and in partnership with God. But really, we are to express the will of God, the heart of God towards creation, in creation, and over creation. And as we saw before, God loves his creation. Right? So that's the kinds of rulers we're meant to be. So, bottom line, Genesis 1-2, just the first 2 chapters of this enormous tome of writing that we call the Bible. Genesis 1-2 is all a Christian needs in order to have a strong biblical mandate to take urgent action on the climate crisis. You only have to read the first 2 chapters, and that should be enough for Christians to be leading the charge of doing urgent action in light of the climate crisis. Many Christian climate movements focus on this aspect, on the Genesis 1-2 aspect, as the basis for their action. They'll use phrases like creation care or creation stewardship. We have this original calling to care for the living system around us. And those are really strong groundings for action on climate. But there's actually a lot more to it, and this is what I want to focus on mostly in this talk right now, in this presentation. Because the fact is the climate crisis is a human crisis. It is about polar bears and rainforests and all these things, but it's also about human beings and the impact on human beings. The climate crisis is a human crisis. Here are a few images. Here is a fossil fuel power plant just pouring toxins into the air right where kids are playing, going down slides. Here is an enormous pile of single-use plastics and other refuse that have just been poured into a community's beach. This, I believe, is a community in the Philippines. Here are climate refugees. They are leaving a place that has sustained them for generations and generations because it is now too hot, too dry. They're running out of water, they're running out of food. They have to go somewhere else to live. They can't live where they have lived. Here is an extreme weather event. This is in the United States. Where are these people going to live? Wildfires. We know these are going crazy, have been over the last few years in the American West. Happened in Greece as well. Fires are showing up all over the place. Australia. Where are these people going to live? So environmental degradation and climate change are making people sick. They're driving them from their homes and they're killing them. And this is happening in numbers that are already huge, and they're growing. And if they're unaddressed, they will become staggering, like at a scale that we really just don't have categories for. So here's some of the major human impacts of climate change, just to look at some of the hard facts. Habitat destruction and species extinctions. So we are currently in the 6th mass extinction of the planet. We are losing species at a rate of 200 per day right now. That's about 1 every 7 minutes, if you can imagine that. At 2 degrees Celsius of warming, which I hope we can keep it to 1.5, as the International Panel on Climate Change, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says we need to, but 2 degrees Celsius is looking like our best bet. We'll see, but at 2 degrees Celsius of warming, there will be no more coral reefs, or 99% of them will be gone. Imagine the impact on people of losing all of this natural beauty. All these species, all this beautiful biodiversity. Just imagine the impact on people. That should matter for its own sake, but what's the impact on people of losing all this beauty? Major increase in damages due to floods, droughts, and storms. On our current emissions trajectory, we can expect to accumulate $600 trillion in climate damages. And when I'm talking about our current emissions trajectory, this is based on information from a few years ago. But if that trajectory just keeps going without dramatic change on our part, these are the things that we can expect. $600 trillion is a staggering number. It's double the total wealth in the world today. We're already seeing damages from floods, droughts, and storms grow today. It's just going to get astronomical without dramatic change. Massive human displacement. On our current trajectory, by 2050, all major Middle Eastern and Indian cities will be unlivably hot during the summer. Sea level rise will make many coastal cities unlivable, and global displacement of people due to heat, flooding, and drought will be 100 million, which is almost 50% more than the total number of displaced people today. It's hard to imagine. There's a massive impact on human health. At 2 degrees Celsius of warming, 150 million people are expected to die from air quality issues alone. That's more than all the deaths from World War I and World War II combined. Tropical diseases will increase and spread further north. Fossil fuel pollution in the air is currently already increasing asthma, autism, ADHD, birth defects, and cancer rates. Chemicals used widely in human products are decreasing sperm counts. That's a whole other thing. Microplastic particles from all the single-use plastics we're using and throwing away are found everywhere now. They're showing up in our food, they're showing up in our bodies, and studies are increasingly showing that they have negative health effects. There'll be a decrease in agricultural productivity as the population increases. So as much as 50% less production as our world reaches 10 billion people. There will be widespread food insecurity and starvation. And then finally, just with all of these stressors coming together and pressuring states and communities, there's going to be an increased potential for wars and for the collapse of nations. Here's some slides from the Evangelical Environmental Network I do some work with. Currently, nearly half of Americans live in areas that have unhealthy air polluted by smog and soot, which is again generated by the burning of fossil fuels. Asthma, autism, ADHD, or severe allergies, these already affect 1 in 4 children in the U.S. In the U.S., there are 200,000 early deaths each year. Fossil fuel burning particles in the air are contributing to an increasing preterm birth, low birth weight, stillbirth during pregnancy, and Black and brown mothers and babies are especially at risk, and we'll talk some more about this a little bit later. Here's something that's truly remarkable. So the Lancet is a medical journal, a very prominent medical journal. Their Commission on Climate Change and Human Health did a study back in 2015, and here are the main findings they found. They found that pollution killed an estimated 9 million people in 2015. That's 3 times more than AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria combined. It's 16% of all deaths worldwide. It's 10 times more deaths than war, terrorism, and all forms of violence. And here's another way to frame this. At that rate of 9 million per year, pollution has killed about 3 times as many people globally as COVID-19 has since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. So here's the reality. There is nothing in our world that will cause more suffering, displacement, poverty, political instability, sickness, and death than unmitigated climate disaster. Nothing even comes close to the suffering that will happen if we do not dramatically reduce global carbon emissions now. So are we connecting these dots as Christians? Right? The climate crisis is a human crisis. Are we feeling that crisis as followers of Jesus? Right, so what is the heart of the Christian calling? And let me go to a chapter, Matthew 22, 35 to 40. Let me just read this. One of the Pharisees, an expert in the law, tested Jesus with this question. Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? And Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. And now for the Jewish community at that time, the phrase law and the prophets, all the law and the prophets, was just a catchphrase for all the scriptures. All the scriptures hang on this call to love God and love your neighbor, which are really two sides of the same coin, which is really a way of saying that you might know all the scriptures, you might follow all the laws, but if your heart doesn't have at its center the love of God and the love of your neighbor, which are inseparably intertwined, you're missing the whole thing. So with that in mind, how does our command to love our neighbor as ourselves relate to the climate crisis? Well, let me give you an example, a river pollution example. So, nice disgusting picture right there of filth being poured into a river. So imagine that there is a village and a river, and upstream you have some industry that's pouring poison, pouring industrial waste into the water, and it's going downstream and it's getting people sick in the village. People are getting sick from this. Now imagine there's a church in that village, and they're like, yeah, we want to follow Jesus, and we know that following Jesus means loving our neighbors, and we see all of our neighbors getting sick, and so what we need to do is we need to care for our neighbors. So they're caring for their neighbors. They're loving their neighbors really well in that way as they get sick. They're trying to help them to heal. But they're not dealing with the upstream pollution. The pollution keeps coming. They're not walking upstream to stop that factory from pouring poison into the water, which is in turn making people sick in the first place, right? Well, the climate crisis is an upstream and systemic poison that is harming, oppressing, and killing people globally. And so the question is, can we love our neighbors locally, regionally, and globally if we are not actively working against the sources of the climate unraveling that is causing our neighbors to suffer in the first place? And by the way, will be causing us to suffer as well, right? Can we just love people by caring for them as they're sick without dealing with the problem that's making them sick? I hope that's a rhetorical question. The answer should clearly be no. And so the message is climate action is a love of neighbor issue, which, as Jesus said, that is the very heart of what it means to be a Christian disciple. It's to be a lover of God and a lover of your neighbor. So the climate action is a love of neighbor issue with massive human implications. And it requires both local care, for example, taking care of these refugees from Afghanistan right here, and upstream change. There's the Capitol building. It means going to the Capitol building and asking our legislators to make different kinds of laws that reduce our emissions. So both local care and upstream change, that is what is needed in order to love our neighbors in light of the climate crisis. But there's even more to it than that. The climate crisis is a love your neighbor crisis. The climate crisis is also a human justice crisis. And let me parse this out. First, let's just see, what does the God of the Bible think about justice? Does he care about it? Well, the God of the Bible is absolutely passionate about justice, particularly passionate for those with the least power. And so here are a few passages, just a few of just so many. The Bible is just full of passages where God talks about how much he loves justice, and he particularly is oriented towards justice for those with the least power. But let me just read you a few. Micah 6:8. He has shown you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Isaiah 1:17. Learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow. Psalm 12:5. Because the poor are plundered and the needy groan, I will now arise, says the Lord. I will protect them from those who malign them. Finally, Luke 7:22. This is when the disciples of John the Baptist come up to Jesus and say, hey, are you the one we should be expecting, or should it be someone else? So Jesus replied to the messengers, go back and report to John what you've seen and heard. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is proclaimed to the poor. So what does the climate crisis have to do with justice? Well, the cause of and the suffering from the climate crisis are not evenly distributed. And let me explain. The reality is rich individuals, communities, and nations, rich, middle income, upper income, powerful individuals, communities, and nations are most responsible for the emissions that are causing the world to heat up and causing the climate to spin out of control. Yet these same communities and individuals and nations are also most able to insulate themselves from its effects for the same reason. They have more power. On the other hand, poor individuals, communities, and nations, or those with less power, are least responsible for the emissions that are causing the crisis, and yet they are at the same time least able to insulate themselves from its effects because, again, they are low income, they have less power. This is fundamentally unjust. Fundamentally unjust. The climate crisis is a massive human injustice. And here's the reality. Poor, mostly black and brown, disproportionately black and brown communities are being sacrificed around the world to run carbon-intensive middle and upper income communities and nations' way of life. This is the reality. So think of it this way. So fossil fuels power our lives. And when I say our, I'm speaking as a middle income American. And the United States is very powerful. Fossil fuels power our lives. But the question is, where are the refineries and power plants built? Where are the highways and the bus depots constructed? We buy, use, and throw away huge quantities of materials, lots of single-use plastics, lots of other things, but where's the waste deposited? Where is it incinerated? Well, the answer is sacrifice zones. Now, what does this mean? Well, sacrifice zones are communities, neighborhoods, and even nations that powerful communities and nations force to bear the waste products from their way of life. They are typically low income, they typically have less power to resist, and they are largely disproportionately black and brown, not white. I just keep bringing this up because there is a deep and profound racial component to this. And the fact is, this practice is not the exception, it's the rule. So let me explain this. So there are all sorts of sacrifice zones. First one is the sacrifice zone for fossil fuel emissions. Fossil fuels drive our vehicles, they power our lives, but at whose expense? Who gets to breathe all those emissions? Well, refineries and power plants are regularly built in or near low-income, predominantly black and brown communities. Highway paths and bus depots are regularly built in and through low-income communities, and again, disproportionately black and brown communities. Let me give you a local example from Philadelphia, which is where I live. There's a neighborhood in North Philly called Nicetown. This is a low-income black and brown community. The air quality in this neighborhood is already low due to the Route 1 overpass. It's like a highway that goes right overhead, and a bus depot that's nearby. It has a lot of idling buses and a lot of emissions. There are currently in this community already lots of respiratory issues and cognitive problems in the neighborhood due to the excessive exposure to fossil fuel emissions from traffic and from the buses. Now, they're already dealing with all the issues of urban poverty on top of that. Now, SEPTA just recently decided that they needed to build a natural gas power generation plant there to help power their fleet. Now, where they could have built it anywhere, but where did they decide to build it? They decided to build it in Nicetown. And actually, there was enormous community opposition to this. There was a whole, and right here you see some people, just a couple people, there were a lot more involved in this, standing out there and protesting. So there's a huge community opposition saying, no, 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 we do not want another source of emissions poisoning the air that our children are breathing here. Please don't build it here. But in the end, SEPTA just built it because SEPTA had the power to, and our mayor signed on to it. I remember having a conversation with someone who was very involved in the protest movement to try to stop SEPTA from building it there. And she heard this comment from someone saying, referring to why was SEPTA building it there? Well, it was because no one important lives there. No one important lives there. And that sums up, I think, in so many ways, the way that these communities are considered or not considered by the people with the power who decide to build their plants and who decide where to build their plants. So imagine SEPTA, our Regional Transportation Authority, trying to build a gas refinery in your neighborhood, maybe a rich neighborhood, a middle-income neighborhood, and imagine them doing it despite the fact that the whole neighborhood rises up in protest. They just ignore you, they build it there. That's what happened in Nicetown. Can you imagine it happening in your neighborhood? It's just a local example of this. SEPTA decided that Nicetown was a sacrifice zone, and so they sacrificed Nicetown to power their fleet. Here's another kind of sacrifice zone, single-use plastics. So single-use plastics are very convenient, right? We can get them, they're very cheap, we use them once, we throw them away, we don't even have to wash them, we just chuck them in a bin and they go somewhere. So we like it, we use single-use plastics all the time, but we use them at whose expense? These things generate enormous quantities of refuse that will not biodegrade for thousands of years. Plastic does not biodegrade. It's now getting broken up. It doesn't biodegrade, but it can get broken up in all these tiny little microplastic particles, which I mentioned before. They're now finding their way into our food and now into human bodies. But right, we continue to generate all this waste. And what happens is it finds its way into the oceans. It clogs low-income ocean communities like this one in the Philippines. It destroys beaches and marine habitats. Right, there is no way. When we throw things away, it goes somewhere. It doesn't just disappear. And a lot of time it's poor communities that get stuck with all the garbage. Here's another one, garbage incineration. Right, in other low-income communities, plastics and other garbage are incinerated in these big industrial strength incinerators, which produces all sorts of respiratory ailments for people. It makes people really sick. It gives them all sorts of breathing problems. I won't go into more detail about this, but watch The Story of Plastic. I highly recommend that. There's the link right there. Watch this movie. It will help you think about using plastics and about single-use plastics and how they are really harming people around the world in order to fuel the convenience of some. Here's another one, sacrifice zones, extreme heat. So one of the things that has happened in a number of poor communities in the United States is that there has been historic disinvestment. And these are largely black and brown urban communities. And what happens when there is historic disinvestment, this creates an environment that actually increases extreme heat. Now, what was this historic disinvestment? It was something called redlining. And what redlining was that public and private money was stripped out of certain communities because an organization made these maps of communities and looked at where there were concentrations of black and brown people, and they labeled those areas hazardous zones, zones where you should not invest, zones where you shouldn't build things, because those you're going to lose your money. And this practice was entirely race-based. And what it did is it stripped money out of communities generationally. And so what happens when that money was stripped out of communities, this loss of investment led over time to more old buildings that couldn't be repaired and that have old black roofs which absorb a lot of heat, led to trees dying out because there was less city planning and planting of trees. There's less planned green space by the city, and they're crumbling in energy inefficient homes. All of these things lead to increased heat, which is something you don't even think about. So there was a study done in Philadelphia not too long ago, which found, it was a heat study that found that certain neighborhoods could be up to 22 degrees Fahrenheit hotter during summer heat waves than other neighborhoods in Philadelphia. One of the cooler neighborhoods is one I live in Mount Airy. It's full of trees. It has a park system going through it. I drive 15 minutes to Hunting Park, and it's 22 degrees Fahrenheit hotter because of all those reasons that I gave, due to past redlining. Well, all the neighborhoods that are extreme heat zones are ones that were redlined in the past, ones that are low income, ones that are largely black and brown communities. There are communities that have been disinvested from, and now as a result of that, they are much, much hotter. Extreme heat is one of the biggest killers of the climate crisis, and poverty has led to these neighborhoods just being extremely hot. There's one of these redlining maps. I don't need to get into it anymore. Finally, we have sacrifice nations. And this is just sort of zooming way back out and seeing the big picture. The Maldives, sea level rise is threatening them. Kiribati is a South Pacific nation with 100,000 inhabitants. This society, this nation, is going to be erased by sea level rise because they're too low to the ground. Sea level rise is being caused by other countries by pouring all these emissions to live our way of life, and that is raising the sea level, and it's going to wipe out this whole nation. Where are those 100,000 people are going to go? Tropical islands in general. Coral is dying off at a massive rate because of the increase in heat. Tourism, fishing, and ecosystem health will all be severely impacted by the coral die-off. Middle East and India, heat will make these places unlivable during the summer. Like, you step out into the summer heat and you won't be able to survive for very long. That's what unlivable means. Where are all these people going to go? Many African nations, for example, Burundi, Congo, South Sudan, and Central African Republic, they're already facing systemic poverty, and then just the climate crisis is going to exacerbate the droughts and things like that. So droughts are going to increase as trajectories of population growth increase. All of this is just going to be devastated by climate change. Where are these people going to go? What are they going to do? And finally, the United Nations is still struggling to get rich countries to contribute what is needed to help the poorer countries adapt to all the climate impacts that the rich countries, have caused. Here is a scene, a flooding scene from Kiribati, that nation that is essentially being swallowed up by the sea because of the climate crisis. Where's that girl gonna go? What is her future? What is her family's future? So to force other communities to bear the consequences of my community's sin is the opposite of the gospel, right? The gospel is that Jesus willingly takes our sin on himself. He bears our sin on himself. For us to then go and force others to bear the consequences of our sin is to live in a way that is fundamentally opposed to the gospel itself. So the climate crisis is fundamentally unjust. Rich individuals, communities, and nations are producing the most emissions, yet poor individuals, communities, and nations are suffering the worst consequences from climate degradation. And the toxic byproducts of our way of life, poisonous emissions, plastic trash, rubbish incarceration, and urban disinvestment leading to extreme heat are placed on poor, mostly black and brown communities. Um, the bottom line is that the powerful are sacrificing the poor to enable their way of life on a global scale. So the question for all of us is, are we part of this? Are we passively accepting this reality? Or are we fighting against it? Looking to change it, right? So here's the summary of all the stuff I've been talking about. Christians have a clear biblical call to take action on the climate crisis. Right? Genesis 1-2 calls us to be caretakers over creation, while the climate crisis is destroying creation. So Genesis 1-2 calls us to serve and to protect creation in light of this. But it's not just about the rest of creation, it's about people as well. So loving God and our neighbors, the heart out of which all healthy Christian discipleship grows. Well, the climate crisis is making people sick, displacing them and killing them on a massive and growing scale. And so we, if we are to love our neighbor, need to be invested locally in caring for them, and we need to be working for upstream change so that it doesn't get worse and worse. And finally, God loves justice, and he's particularly oriented towards the well-being of those with the least power. Well, the climate crisis is a global expression of a systemic, materials and energy-based form of oppression of the poor by the rich, of the less powerful by the more powerful. Right? So said another way, the climate crisis is an anti-shalom reality. But Christians are called to pursue shalom, God's peace, God's kingdom, his flourishing, everything being right and just and beautiful in this world. This is our calling. So let me read, as I kind of close up this part, let me just read you the parable of the sheep and the goats. And as we look through it, this teaching of Jesus, I want you to think about a climate refugee. I want you to think about the challenges that people are facing in light of the climate crisis. So just have that in your mind and let me read this. So Matthew 25:31-46. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you?" The king will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." Then he will say to those on his left, "Depart from me, you who are cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not invite me in. I needed clothes, and you did not clothe me. I was sick and in prison, and you did not look after me." They also will answer, "Lord, when did we see you hungry, or thirsty, or a stranger, or needing clothes, or sick, or in prison, and did not help you?" He will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me." Then they will go away to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life. The parable of the sheep and the goats is eerily applicable to the kinds of suffering arising from and growing out of the climate crisis. And according to Jesus, he's saying that it's how we engage these kinds of human needs, these kinds of human suffering, that shows how aligned our hearts are with him and his gospel. Right? This is the sign of where our roots are. Christ's church needs to take spiritual and moral leadership on the climate crisis. For all of these reasons, this is our calling. we need to take spiritual and moral leadership on the climate crisis. So what can we do? I'm just going to give a few practical things that we can look at. So first, what we can do is we can do personal change. Reduce your carbon footprint. Your carbon footprint is the amount of fossil fuel emissions that are burned in order to enable your way of life. And I put this in parentheses, pursue integrity, because if we want to talk about the climate crisis, but we're not doing things about it in our own life, there's a breach in integrity. We're not whole. Our words and our actions are not aligned. And so what we need to do is we need to embrace the changes that's needed in our own lives so that we can speak with integrity about the importance of this. All right? So if you want to reduce your carbon footprint, go to bit.ly/net-zero-household. Go there. I have created an online resource with tons and tons of ways that you can reduce your household, your family's carbon footprint. And here's one of the great things about it. Most of the changes you can make will save you money, either immediately or over time. You might have to invest a little bit up front, but it will pay off in huge dividends over time. There are a few things that will just cost a little more, but the whole reason for it is so that we are investing in a livable future for our children. So I think it's worth the investment. So in any case, I always say that because if you don't care about the climate crisis, maybe you care about money. So, go for it. A lot of these things are going to save you money. So it's important for us to make personal changes, but here's what I want to really emphasize. Personal changes are not enough to reduce global emissions at the rate we need to. We need to reduce global emissions, global fossil fuel emissions by 50% in 8 years. And then we need to bring them back down the remaining 50% by 2050. This is a monumental task. It's an all hands on deck moment, in our world, for the world. So we need to do personal changes, but there's more that we can do. So let me get into the systemic changes we need. So first systemic change, number one, the way you can contribute to it is talk about the climate crisis. And in parentheses, I've said here, change social will. So we have all the technology. We got all the math, all the numbers. We know how to reduce emissions at the rate we need to do it. We just need to get over that tipping point of social will to drive all these things forward. And so what this means is we need to talk about it. Talk about it with people. Talk about how important this is. Talk about why it's so important to you as a Christian to dramatically reduce our emissions, to change our way of living. So think about this. Where do you have a voice? Could be your family. It might be a club you're a part of. It might be a school you're a part of. It might be a homeowners association. It could be your job. Like, where do you have a voice? Where will people hear you? Where can you speak? So think about that and then start speaking. The other thing I want to talk about specifically is your church engaged from a faith perspective? Are they engaged? Is the church seeing? Is it your church connecting the dots between the calling for stewardship, the calling to love our neighbor, and the calling to pursue justice, and how all of that relates to the climate crisis? See if you can build something at your church. Speak with people there. Use your voice. It's important. And here's what I would recommend. Go to search YouTube and find Catherine Hayo's TED Talk. Just do a search for Catherine Hayo TED Talk, and it will come up. You'll find it. She's a bit of a rock star in the Christian climate advocacy world. She's a climate scientist, and she has done a bunch of different speaking and has lots of really great thoughts. But her TED Talk is really excellent, and one of the things she emphasizes is talking about the climate crisis with people. Right, so that's systemic change number one. Talk about it. Talk in the spaces where you have a voice. Systemic change number two, advocate for climate action, which I've put in parentheses here, change laws. Because again, we can't make change at the rate we need to make it just by making personal changes or just by trusting the market. We need governments to take action and make laws that will press our emissions trajectory down harder and harder by impacting the market, by impacting all sorts of things. We need laws. With laws, we can do it. Without laws, we can't. So we need laws. So advocate for climate action. So vote for climate justice champions. Given the huge impact on the world, on human beings, we should not be having lawmakers who are ignoring the climate crisis, avoiding making laws about it, pretending it's not there. Right? We need lawmakers who care about the climate crisis, who have connected the dots, who see its impact on people, and who are voting for good laws. So use your vote. Register to vote if you haven't. And if you are registered, vote in every election and vote for climate justice champions. Second, march in climate justice actions. There are all sorts of marches going on all over the place. And the point of marching is to disrupt society. It's to take over the street and to show the surrounding society that the way we are living is not sustainable. It can't continue this way for our world. It needs to stop. There need to be fundamental changes. So march. Finally, join climate justice advocacy groups. There are all sorts of groups doing all sorts of incredible work. And chances are, if you have a voice and you want to make your voice more and more powerful, joining people who are doing the work will give you platforms to use your voice. It'll empower your voice. So I highly recommend that. Here in Philadelphia, I'm involved with a group called Power. I'm involved with another group called Here for CJ, which is looking for housing justice solutions that are climate oriented. I don't know where you are, but there are all sorts of groups to get involved in. You can email me. I'll put my email at the end if you want to get connected. And then finally, I haven't called this a systemic change, but more a collective response. Prepare to receive refugees. Be Jesus' hands. Now, I live in Philadelphia, and so I'll just speak about Philly. Philly is likely to be a climate refugee receiver in the future. As climate change increases, the impacts increase as the number of refugees increases. Philly is going to be taking in a lot of refugees. So we want to be thinking about that, preparing ourselves for it, to be Jesus' hands, to be sheep, according to Matthew 25, with the people who come and who have these needs, who are hungry, who are thirsty, who need clothes, who need a place to stay. We need to fight for good refugee policy in our government, laws that are compassionate towards refugees, that help find them a place. And for us personally, we need to prepare our hearts, we need to prepare our budgets, and we need to prepare our space to receive the suffering for Jesus' sake. Right? We need to be a community of hospitality for Jesus' sake as refugees come in. Finally, some resources. I have done a 3-part biblical climate justice series from a church in Philadelphia. I did them called C4 Church. bit.ly/biblical climate action is a quick link to get there. That is a 3-part deep dive theologically into our calling as Christians to take action on the climate crisis. If you're in the Philly area, I am partnering with the Evangelical Environmental Network, and they have this group called EEN Partners program. And we're doing a training. We're looking to host a training on what we hope will be October 29th, 2022. We're not totally sure about that date, but we are working towards that date. This is going to be an all-day in-person event where people will have the opportunity to learn all sorts of things about how to build energy, build conversations, and build a climate action team within their own congregations, within their own churches. It's going to be a really great event, so I highly recommend that you join. If you want to be made aware of it, if you're interested, just email me. My email's at the bottom. Here's a CWP link on how to build a congregational creation care team. bit.ly/CWP creation care team. That's just another quick link to get here. It's a bunch of different resources on a page produced by the Climate Witness Project that give you all sorts of helpful information on how to start your own creation care team at your church. Here's a resource packet that I built for an event that we did for a bunch of pastors in the Philly area, bit.ly/CWP Philly Climate Resources. That has all sorts of stuff in it, including all this other stuff that's above it, and that QR code right there goes to that site. And then finally, there is my email. If you are interested in connecting, in learning more, and having a follow-up conversation, feel free to email me. I love to talk about about climate justice, about how we can get engaged as followers of Jesus. So that is it from me. Thanks very much for taking the time to listen to this, and God's blessings to you.